It's the week ending Saturday, the 26th of January, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Venezuela's opposition leader declaring himself president in an apparent coup, engineering company Dyson announcing they're to leave the UK for Singapore, and a film from Mexico leading the nominations for the 2019 Academy Awards. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Jamie Timson, Holden Frith, and from the Week Junior, it's none other than, yes, Felicity Capon. Felicity, you're starting the show this week. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Why the Communist Party in China might be playing Cupid with its citizens' lives.
Given China's traditional preference for boys, you have a surplus of boys, mainly concentrated in rural areas of China where parents were most keen to have a boy because they needed him for the farm, and tradition just also weighed a bit more heavily and they wanted a son. There were girls born under this period of time, and they happened to be born primarily in urban areas where parents were a bit more open-minded, and they said, all right, we've got a daughter. We're going to raise her as if she were a son. So we're going to give her every opportunity to study and achieve, and we're going to push her hard to bring honor to our family. And as a result, you have China's first generations of only daughters who are this kind of very fine silver lining of an otherwise kind of very gruesome cloud of a one-child policy, who got access to unprecedented opportunities.
That was Roseanne Lake, author of Leftover in China, speaking recently to Business Insider about how women who aren't married by 25 are reshaping China's traditional culture. So, Felicity, what's the story this week?
The story this week is that there are a couple of Chinese firms who have announced that they will be giving single female employees over the age of 30 an additional 8 days of annual dating leave, partly in a boost to...
Dating leave. You said that like that's just a normal thing.
Well, it could soon be in China. The idea is that management have said some unmarried women who are over the age of 30 can have an additional 8 days of leave over Chinese New Year to go home and date.
Okay, so hold on. We were saying about reshaping the traditional culture. This doesn't sound like it's reshaping the culture. This sounds like traditional culture, saying if you're not married by 30, that's a problem. You're going to need time off work to sort it out. Yeah,
it's kind of a big problem in China is that there are a lot of so-called leftover women. The term for it is shengnu. I mean, it's very, on the surface, sort of patronising and irritating, but actually deep down, it's kind of insidious propaganda from a Chinese government that is trying to reinforce the idea that if you are single over 30, you've done something wrong, basically, if you haven't met someone. And it all goes back to China's falling birth rate and the fact that it's very worried about a dwindling workforce and an elderly population. So it's quite a serious thing.
Jamie, you're in a couple, I believe.
Yes.
But if you weren't, would you appreciate Dennis Publishing giving you 8 days off a year to go and meet the right person?
From a purely practical perspective, who are they dating if the men aren't given the extra day's leave? When they're going back to...
Unemployed men.
Oh.
I presume. I mean, you make a good point.
That's not good for...
But still, reasonable sires to their children, I suppose, is the point.
Yeah, I guess so. I imagine, as Felicity says, it's from it's coming from this decision by the Chinese government to try and do something about the stalling population growth. I wonder if maybe from, a Chinese perspective, they have understood and from a kind of women's perspective, they've seen the benefits of being, prosperous and single and all of those things, and whether or not they are no longer doing it. I just don't think this is going to work.
That's the thing, isn't it, Holden? It's not necessarily that these women are failing at dating. It's that many of them, I presume, have chosen to have careers. They've been brought up in the environment we just heard outlined for us, where they were only children and felt special and entitled, and they've gone out there and got it, and actually there isn't time for them to find dating along the way.
It struck me as a sort of good news story and a sad news story and a weird news story all rolled into one. There's the sort of sadness of this idea of women being left over, but I think the sort of good news lurking in there is this sense of agency and different priorities that Chinese women apparently have sort of gained over the past 20, 25 years.
And could those women find it empowering, do you think, to be told you've got dating leave rather than patronising?
I don't know. I mean, I wonder whether the practical aspect of getting 8 days off outweighs that slightly creepy sense of the government interfering in your dating life.
I mean, I've asked both of the men how they feel. How would you feel, Felicity?
I would feel completely patronised. I mean, I'd take it and go off on holiday. I'd go off on holiday somewhere. Like, yeah, sure. Yeah. But I mean, it's pressure, and it's almost a bit sort of dystopian Handmaid's Tale-y, isn't it? The government getting involved in your dating life, and also the fear from whoever's in charge of the country that what happens if all these women do want to be financially independent and not have children and not get into stuffy marriages? What happens then if they don't have control over women's fertility and their reproduction? That's quite a scary dystopian thing, and this is kind of propaganda saying you're a freak if you don't have
How many years would you get the 8 days off for? That's the thing, isn't it? 10 years on, you still haven't found the right person. Are you still taking the leave?
But it's interesting because I think also in China you're seeing the rise of a lot of financially independent women, and they have a lot of purchase power and they are driving the economy in some areas. So they are a demographic that the Chinese government does have to be quite careful with in terms of how they are treating them. There was a very good article in Vogue by Pip Usher, who was talking about the kind of culture of leftover women and the stigma of that. But interestingly, fake boyfriends are becoming a really big industry because it's not just pressure from the government that you should be in a couple, it's also pressure from your parents or your grandparents. There is a culture and a tradition that says you meet someone. So you're seeing a lot of women who want to maintain their independence and have their careers and their lives, but they have to go home to their parents and they take with them a fake boyfriend to say, oh,
an
look
actual
at me.
Person.
Yeah.
I was imagining like the kind of Japanese, blow-up doll type scenario. But
A real man who, they command quite a high fee, so you can take home a bloke and say, look, I've made it.
Honestly,
and then ditch him once you've done the whole meet and greet the parents, go back to your fabulous single life.
It's a thing that happens in Japan as well. I would recommend everyone read. There was an article in the New Yorker about this, the idea of a fake family that you can hire, and it was a absolutely jaw-dropping study into, the people that take part, like the actors that are taking part, like what are they doing, what role are they playing in this, but then also the people who are choosing to buy into this, to buy people to come to their family, to their wedding, to those kind of things, and all the different layers.
Japan is actually another country where population growth has stalled, and like China actually had been worried about a population explosion, but has now started to worry about the opposite, and that does seem to be a pattern we're seeing across quite a lot of the world.
Let's talk about that actually, Holden, because I don't know why I'm turning to you on this, but you feel like the right person for this question. Running business in China was about getting both Western companies to invest there for their factories, so that needs young people, and also about selling more consumer goods in China because you've got a growing middle class. That's what they're battling against.
Yes, and the whole structure of most societies really is based on the idea that the next generation will be larger than the one it replaces, because you need a larger working population to pay for the pensions and the healthcare and the sort of general social safety net. And in the West, when population growth has started to fall, we've generally turned to immigration to kind of bolster that working population. China and Japan have both chosen not to follow that path, and so they instead are really trying to kind of now incentivize fertility, essentially, amongst their population.
And on that point, are they incentivizing fertility, do you think, Felicity? Because actually, if you wanted that holiday every year, you could argue they're actually incentivizing staying single.
It depends, I think, whether you buy into the whole pressure that you desperately need to have a baby or not. I mean, otherwise I think you're just going to play the government at its own game, really, aren't you? But I think, as Holden was saying, it is a huge problem across East Asia in particular. South Korea is a really good example of a government that is desperately now starting to incentivize childbirth. It poured 70 billion into it last year and is doing everything it can to reduce the financial hurdles of raising children. And that's partly, again, because of a legacy of, in previous decades, having a campaign where women couldn't have any more than 2 children, which worked all too well. But as a result, the rate of children being born is, at an absolute record low, which is a real problem for South Korea. And they are now having to look at pumping money into schemes that makes it far more attractive for women to have children.
I think as well with China, they're fighting against years and years, 3 decades of hefty fines being placed on parents that had more than one child, all of these policies. And, I was reading a BBC article where there were young Chinese people saying that they had seen the benefits of being an only child, personal and from an economic perspective, as an only child. Why would I've never wanted siblings, no. So you can see why, from their perspective, why would they have more kids? What's in it for them, apart from, obviously, if there can be an incentive, through money or something else.
OK, Jamie, you're up next after this. Jamie, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Are the bucolic pastures of the UK's countryside hiding an ugly truth?
Nobody speaks for these people, ever. Even Jeremy Corbyn, for all his, one hopes, sincere concern for the less fortunate, never really addresses what it would be like to be under house arrest in your own home, to be stranded in 21st century Britain. And the reason why it happens is quite frightening, because it's kind of the definition of the direction in which many vested interests are taking us at the moment. The idea that if it's not commercially justified, if it's not something that business wants to do, then it shouldn't happen at all. This is what these absolute jokers who describe themselves as classical liberals or libertarians, or who work for mysteriously funded lobby groups like the ludicrously misnomered Taxpayers Alliance, they all hinge upon the idea that business should essentially run everything.
Jamie, you clipped out your own interior monologue for this week's audio highlight. But actually, that was James O'Brien channeling you on his LBC radio show this week. But Jamie, what was he actually talking about? Because that could have been any number of things.
Yes, he was talking about an article in HuffPost about a community in Staffordshire that had lost its local bus route on a Sunday, and it had looked into the effect that was having on the people that were using the buses. And it also comes at the same time as there was another article in The Guardian on a similar topic about a man that had to walk 12 miles every week to go to his job centre appointment because he couldn't afford the bus ride, and that bus route was eventually going to be taken away.
OK, but what's the big story here? Because we're supposed to be focusing on, the great undiscussed stories of the week. You've brought us 2 bus routes on a Sunday are closing down. This is local news stuff. Why is this important?
It points to a movement away from, and actually a kind of bigger issue of rural isolation. So there are 10 million people living in the countryside as it is defined in England, and the services, the public services, have been completely cut back. Crime is at record levels in rural areas. 70% of English farmers have experienced crime in the last 12 years. There is a huge problem in terms of education, so a lot of the schools are being left behind. The Campaign for Better Transport has said that since 2010, councils in England and Wales have cut £182 million from the support they give to bus routes. North Yorkshire has seen 81% of their bus routes cut. OK,
we'll talk about the rural isolation thing in a minute, because that is a fair answer to my question about why this is important. But on the bus routes thing, and Holden, if there aren't customers to take the buses, you can understand why the council, looking at the figures, they have to make hard decisions, would say, well, that is the thing to cut. If people want the buses, they need to get on the buses.
That argument can become self-fulfilling, I think, because once you start to cut back on the frequency of bus routes, they then become less useful, and so that leads to fewer people using them. I grew up in the middle of Norfolk, and there was a once-an-hour bus into Norwich, and it would often be cancelled too, so you'd end up having to wait up to 2 hours for a bus, and that just doesn't work if you're a commuter. So it automatically becomes a service that the only people who use it are the people who can't afford any other way. So yes, you do then end up with generating less revenue with that service, and so when you do have to make cuts, as a lot of councils have had to, it's easier to eliminate those services.
And the price as well. I was really shocked to read in that Guardian long read, which is one of these 2 articles that you put forward, Jamie, that the bus that chap was trying to catch to Huntingdon cost £7 to get from his village. I mean, should any bus cost £7? But that's like the price of a coach, isn't it?
And it's going by bus is the most popular form of transport in the UK, and part of the reason is because it's supposed to be so cheap and so easy.
And that's the subsidised cost.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, I think it's also, this whole story is just totally strapped to councils, isn't it? I mean, in one of the articles, someone was saying that councils are almost faced with, do we provide adult social care or do we keep bus routes going? I don't think anyone's getting rid of these bus routes, for a jolly. They also calculated that some bus routes, keeping them running, are now costing the taxpayer about £10 per route. So it's just not economically viable to keep them going in a way.
Okay, and I kind of wish Cameron Tate was here for this question, but I'm going to put it to you, Jamie. Surely there's a technological solution to this? Because it seems to me like out of all of the travel industries that is yet to be disrupted, buses are right up there, aren't they? I mean, there should be some, not for the older people that are isolated that you're talking about, but for people who are technologically fluent. You'd think if you live in the countryside, there should be an app, there should be a website, there should be one way of saying, I want to get from here to here.
Why not the elderly? Why are you just leaving the elderly out there?
Because I'm saying, obviously, people in their 80s might struggle to use an app. That's what I mean.
But that's part of the problem.
Sure. We'll get to that. I'm just saying, in the future, surely it should be the case that there's some technological way, rather than waiting and standing at a bus stop in the rain for something that might not come. Yeah. There's got to be some disruptive way of saying, I want to get from here to here, help me.
The joined-up thinking argument, of using apps and technology to basically fill in the gaps between people that have been left behind is a really good idea. And in fact, I mean, to take an example of something that's happened in the city and has been disruptive, there's this thing called the City Mapper buses that run now on specific routes, and you then use an app to then get on board it, and they are like little mini buses that take you from destinations, and they use algorithms and data from TfL to find out journeys that are popular that aren't being solved by public transport. Now that is certainly something that could be used in rural areas to join up people who need to get from A to B. There is a huge amount of money that the NHS is spending, something like £2 billion a year that the NHS spends on getting people from rural areas to appointments. There's only becoming more pressure on them because of the rural services that are disappearing. If you can design a service to meet the collective needs of the communities, then we can think about moving stuff forward. I mean, Felicity is completely right in the sense that the cuts are the reason that this is happening. The cuts are the reason that we've got isolation. And, I've said many times, James O'Brien has said many times that the cuts are an ideological part of this government's decisions, and this is what austerity is doing. But at this point now, you're right, there should be a move by technology to join the stuff up.
Or a government move, actually, to fill in the gaps where local councils cannot provide services. Because even the Conservatives would say we wanted local councils to cut their budgets as much as possible, but probably not do things like this. So you should be able to move pots of money from councils that are doing better into ones that are doing worse, no?
But are there councils that are doing well?
That is the problem.
This isn't a counter-argument exactly, because I'm talking about the biggest city in the UK rather than rural services, but buses in London have been a success story, and usage grew by 40% between 2000 and 2005, and that was partly a technological solution. I think the smart card payments made a big difference because that cut journey times, because drivers weren't having to handle cash. In a lot of rural buses, you're still paying by cash. But also the massive increase in bus lanes made those journeys more efficient. It is about finding a way of making rural buses more attractive, and I think there could be a technological solution there, something in between Uber and Dial-A-Ride and a minibus, where you kind of you do get a sense of where there's demand.
I love that as a Silicon Valley pitch, don't you? It's a cross between Uber and Dial-A-Ride.
But you do also need, I think, that sense of purpose amongst local politicians in order to have a strategy for buses in a way that we don't at the moment. There's much more attention on railways, on airports, on roads, private cars, and how we're providing services for those. And buses really are just a forgotten service.
OK, we are in danger of becoming Radio Norfolk, so I am going to move away from buses onto your macro point, Jamie. Rural isolation, go.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's been so much hand-wringing, particularly in the Westminster bubble or, the metropolitan elite, about what Brexit really was about and what it means. These kind of things are people's day-to-day lives outside of, we're talking about 10 million people that live in the countryside. That's bigger than London. This isn't a small fry thing, but as this article by Louise Tickle was talking about in The Guardian, is that they're not worried about the kind of macro level discussions of what's going on in Westminster. If it's true that you're going to have to walk 12 miles in the dark to go to get your, job centre to sign on, it has been a creeping move from the government to focus away from the problems of I couldn't believe it when I heard that stat about crime in rural areas. And, that is cutbacks on police forces that are focusing on where the biggest, if there's a robbery in Westminster, everyone is aware of it because there are more police and all of those things. Whereas if it happens in rural Staffordshire, why is one more important than the other?
I think it also makes me feel as though the country is increasingly going to become somewhere where only rich, affluent people can live, because until we get all our fancy new technology that's going to revolutionise buses. You have to have a car, you have to have a means of getting around. And that's quite scary as well. And it sort of reminds me of something out of This Country, the BBC award-winning sitcom, which is absolutely hilarious, but there's also a very, very sad element to it that communities are just getting behind. It feels like you almost have to have your hunter wellies and your barber jackets if you want to, live in the countryside, which is just incredibly sad. But I think also the media probably has a role to play in it too. And I think, as Jamie was saying, it is that Westminster bubble, and it's the cuts to kind of local newspapers who would be monitoring this and would be able to kick up more of a fuss, and that's just not really happening.
Okay, but those cuts aren't government cuts. That's because people aren't buying them, and that really is because people aren't buying them.
Yeah, true. But, I mean, the whole thing is a tragedy.
Okay, one last story to come after this. And so finally this week, Holden, what do you think this week will be remembered for?
This week we need to talk about the elephant in the room.
Super tuskers, elephants with tusks estimated to weigh 100 pounds or more, are becoming almost impossible to find.
There were hundreds of 100-pounders 60, 80, 100 years ago. Why do we only have 20 to 30 now?
That was Dr. Johan Moraes, and before that, Greg Nelson in the nature film Last of the Big Tuskers. You can watch the full movie at ecostreams.vhx.tv. That's a quirky web address, so I'll say it again, ecostreams.vhx.tv. Catchy stuff. Holden, what is your story of the week?
The story is that it's emerged this week that in parts of Africa where poaching has been a serious problem, elephants are starting to be born without tusks. And not just a few of them either. In Addo National Park in South Africa, 98% of female elephants are being born tuskless.
I mean, what? Doesn't evolution take centuries, millennia?
It does.
I mean, how long's poaching been going on for?
It does when you're talking about natural selection, but I suppose the point of this is it's unnatural selection, and it's happening in quite an extreme way. In some national parks, poaching has been so extensive that 90% of elephants have been killed. And there is a natural appearance in the population of elephants without tusks. About 4% of females, just through natural variation, are born without these tusks. So poachers obviously aren't going to kill any of those.
Oh, and those are the ones that are reproducing?
Yeah, so the only
okay.
genes that get passed on are from elephants which don't have tusks.
So it's not evolution, it's that the only elephants mating are the ones that are alive, which are the ones that haven't been killed because of their tusks.
It is a massively accelerated form of evolution where instead of one variation having a 1% advantage over the rest, it's pretty binary. You live if you don't have tusks, you die if you do.
It is fascinating and it is underreported, so tick tick, but so what? I mean, why is this an important story?
I think it's important on a few levels. One is the impact on the elephant populations and what it means about their behaviour, because it seems these tuskless elephants are surviving. They're just having to travel further in order to get the food and water they would otherwise need, because they can't use their tusks to push down trees, they can't dig for water. I think the bigger side of the story really is as a symbol of human impact on wildlife and how this could possibly be a motivating factor for the conservation movement.
I mean, Felicity, I'm curious to get your view on this, because if you're writing about this in the Week Junior, where you like to focus on good news stories for understandable reasons, young readers, is this a good news? Like, on the one hand, because of poaching, elephants might survive. But on the other hand, poaching is bad, taking tusks from elephants, that's bad. It's kind of like nature's found a solution. Is that a good news story or not?
Yeah, I mean, nature's incredibly resilient, isn't it? And it's sort of fighting back in all sorts of ways. I think that's quite sad, actually. I would just say we don't just do positive stories in the magazine. Unfortunately, the world we live in dictates that we have to do a lot of stories like this, and this is a big one at the moment because I think it's something that, rightly so, a lot of young people really, really care about, and I wish more adults cared in the same way. It's one of the joys of working on a magazine with an audience that is actually passionate about this kind of thing. I think what's interesting about this story is that you're also seeing evolutionary changes across the natural world. That the big question today, I guess, is whether plants and animals can adapt quickly enough to outpace climate change. And you are seeing some extraordinary things across the animal and plant world. There was a study in Science where scientists looked at 21 species in 60 countries to do with animals who are camouflaged and will sort of shed their brown fur to white when there's snow. So you have animals like the snowshoe hare or the Arctic fox. And because of lessening snow and milder winters in places like Finland and Canada and North America, you're seeing animals increasingly maintain browner fur so that they can stay camouflaged in their environments. And that is one way that you are seeing animals fighting back against the sort of horrors that we're unleashing on the natural world.
And Jamie, there's another nature story that you've spotted that might help bring a bit of clarity to this. Tell me about thiamine.
Yeah, so it was one of the kind of odd things that I couldn't believe that I hadn't heard about it before, not because of my prowess in reading around the subject, but just because it is such a huge issue. But it appears that animals across the planet are being paralysed and dying from vitamin B1 deficiency, which is thiamine. And fish and birds are especially seem to be affected, as worldwide seabird populations have plummeted by 70%. I mean, no one is quite sure why this is happening, but it basically appears to be that the rising levels of CO2 in the atmosphere mean that every leaf and grass blade on Earth is pumping more sugars out into the atmosphere. And then it's like the greatest injection of carbohydrates into the biosphere in human history is what it's described as. And this is then causing deficiency in fauna in terms of what they eat and that kind of thing. And I mean, it's like it's open-mouthed again. I will use that phrase again, but it is open-mouthed, kind of shocking to see the decline. And as it's happening, I think to go back to the elephants just quickly, I think the reason that people don't really take it in is because elephants aren't seen, it's like that thing of like, oh, that's great that they're kind of trundling around in Africa. But elephants are so important to the ecosystem, particularly in Africa, but kind of worldwide. And I think when people get their heads around exactly what this kind of wider spread movement of tuskless elephants is doing, it means that people are much more, or it hopefully means that people are much more aware of actually how this could affect them, because it's a selfish thing,
They're quite healthy, these elephants without tusks.
Well,
but there aren't that many of them.
Tusk correspondent, what can elephants do that they can't do without tusks?
It means they're less efficient at grazing, digging for water, pushing down trees, stripping bark off trees. But they do seem to be adapting to this, so it doesn't seem to be damaging them. In response to Jamie's point, I think I'd almost put it the other way around, actually. I think the part of the problem with the conservation movement and the stories that get told around it is that they can seem quite small or academic or too big. Climate change is just such a difficult thing to wrestle with. Whereas I think this elephant story almost has the feeling of an Aesop's fable. That you can imagine the story of how the elephant lost its tusk. And just seeing a photograph of a herd of elephants with no tusks looks so arresting that I think that's the kind of image that can actually motivate change in a way that the sort of slightly more academic and distant research can't cut through.
And on the thiamine thing, yes. Jamie, is the point that humans should intervene and give vitamin shots to birds and wildlife?
I think that we are going to have to. There's lots and lots of discussions about, the things that humans have done in the past that have caused huge problems. But yes, something that we are going to have to intervene again to change the ecosystem. I think that's a kind of a given if we want to at least attempt to try and recreate and regrow the natural habitat that we've destroyed.
I'm almost more, I don't know, the idea that you would see a herd of elephants without tusks and be shocked into action, I'm not sure is 100% true, because I think the problem is that the further we go, children growing up might just assume that elephants never had tusks in the first place, and especially if some elephants already didn't. I'm not sure that is going to be so impactful. There's a really good article which I'd recommend in the New York Times called "The Insect Apocalypse is Here," which is about how insects are just being wiped out. And it's a very moving beginning to a piece of a boy in Denmark, I believe, who is cycling along a country path and suddenly realises that unlike when he was a child, he doesn't have swarms of insects in his face everywhere and it's suddenly insect free. But one of the most fascinating things about this article is the idea that we're almost sort of forgetting how things used to be in the natural world, and that's really scary. So there was a great quote from a 1995 study which says with every generation the amount of environmental degradation increases, but each generation takes that amount as the new norm. And it cites the example of decades of photos of fishermen holding up their catch in the Florida Keys. They refer to it as a phenomenon called the shifting baseline syndrome, where the fish are getting smaller and smaller to the point where the prize catches are dwarfed by fish that in the past years were huge, but that's just your new norm and you don't sort of realise what's happening, and I think that's what's so worrying.
And you don't want to be telling your kids about we used to have seagulls, like they used to fly around all around here, and the kid just being like, okay, cool. Well,
on that note, actually, one of the more bizarre offshoots of the poaching story this week was about an attempt by Israel to get woolly mammoths declared protected species. The reason being that at the moment trade in woolly mammoth ivory is legal, and if they're protected species, even though they've been extinct for several thousand years, trade in their ivory will then be prohibited too, and that will prevent people from trading elephant ivory and rhino horn under the pretense that it's actually from woolly mammoths.
And that affects Israel how?
I'm not sure why Israel
I'm not saying it's an ignoble thing, but,
Yeah, I think just a benevolent sense of making the world a better place.
Well, you mentioned that there was an Aesop's fable, Holden, that last story. You know what I'm going to ask you to do to finish us off, don't you?
No.
I want you to provide the moral. That's what happens at the end of an Aesop's fable. What have we learned in today's edition of The Week Unwrapped?
We've learned that humans can have a profound effect on their environment in ways they don't necessarily expect.
And that's it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Holden Frith, Felicity Capon and Jamie Timson. And we have conserved every utterance from this podcast ever. 2-year history we have, ready for you to hear when you subscribe to this podcast for free. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your app of choice and hit subscribe. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.